Welcome, viewers. You're joining us here in Scope. I'm Waqar Rizvi. Thank you for joining us for this episode. In today's first segment, we're going to discuss Brexit. And of course, a lot has happened ever since Prime Minister Johnson, as well as the EU, have announced that they've come to some sort of a deal. The deal, of course, as far as what Theresa May had agreed upon with the bloc, still remains in place. The only difference now is the issue over the Irish backstop. That has now changed. The details of that, of course, are important, saying that Northern Ireland does remain in the UK customs territory, but all EU rules will apply to goods arriving there. It's a complex system, certainly. There are sides that are happy about this, sides that are not. Of course, the hard Brexiteers, or those who are very much on the Brexit side, seemingly a lot of them are happy with this. The DUP, though, which is vital to this coalition that is in place right now in the UK, ruling that country, is not happy about this, saying it will not vote for this deal. Labour is also saying this deal is even worse than what Theresa May had agreed upon with the EU. Let's discuss all of this a bit further, as well as the other ramifications of this and whether really this will go through in Parliament at this point. We're now joined by Linda Bazant, who is a barrister and Brexit consultant. She's joining us now from Surrey. And joining us from London is Chris Southworth, who is the Secretary General of the International Chambers of Commerce UK. Chris and Linda, thank you both for your time this morning. Linda, I'd like to start with you. What do you make of the deal? Some of the details, of course, have come out. And of course, as I said, the most important issue remains very much the Irish border.
Yes, that's very true. CBI and the IMF have come out in favour of the deal this morning, although they are saying that it's not perfect, but they are urging MPs to get behind it and vote for it on Saturday.
And do you think it's a good deal, Linda? Do you think that this should go through?
I think at the moment it's the best deal that we're going to get under the circumstances. We've been going through this for nearly 3 years now. We've had Theresa May's deals that haven't gone through and actually failed by a very large margin. There are noises in the direction of the fact that Boris's deal is going to come very close, possibly, to being passed. And there are at least 50 MPs who have Leave constituencies who are expected to vote for the deal.
All right, so Chris, what are your thoughts on this? Because again, Labour is saying this is even worse than what May had come to an agreement with the EU. DUP not happy either. Will this go through? What are your thoughts on this?
I think it's really hard to predict whether it will go through or not. There certainly seems to be significant opposition at this point in time. The numbers in Parliament are extremely tight. But I think we have to. The message from us is very simple. That any deal is less than what we have, but any deal is better than a no deal. Most companies are not prepared in the event of any hard deal, and that means all sorts of potential for disruption, both to UK companies exporting and importing, but also foreign companies operating in the UK.
Right. And, Chris, one of the major things that always comes up talking about, especially the Irish border, and for a lot of us outside of the UK, it's always sort of hard to wrap our heads around the arrangement that exists right now between Northern Ireland and Ireland and that border and how it works. But certainly there's a lot of sensitivities there. There's historical sensitivities as well. Will all of that come back up to the surface? Seemingly, people in Northern Ireland aren't that worried about it, or am I wrong about that? Do you think that this will just remain fine and that there won't be any sensitivities brought up again to the fore?
Well, I think what's interesting about the Irish border, particularly coming from the International Chamber of Commerce, actually, it is a perfect example that when you remove a border, how that can create both prosperity and peace for two different countries. And that's been extraordinarily successful. That's what's called the Good Friday Agreement. And of course, the risk is that if you put in place a hard border, those troubles and conflicts then start to come to the fore again. And that's what everybody is committed to make sure that doesn't happen. The trouble is when you leave the EU from the UK perspective, it's very hard to ensure there is an open, seamless border while still having customs checks. So what we're going to end up having, if this deal goes through, is customs checks in the Irish Sea, which really sort of carves Northern Ireland out from the rest of the UK. And then Northern Ireland will operate in a sort of a double customs zone, both in the EU, but also in what would become the UK customs territory. and then operating in many ways under two different regulatory regimes. So it's complicated, but ensuring that conflict doesn't arise has to be the number one priority, whatever happens.
Indeed. And Linda, do you think that this deal does its best to ensure that no conflict will arise in that territory?
Well, yes, I think so. I know we're having issues with the DUP, but with regard to the Troubles, neither side wants the Troubles to return. And I'm quite sure that Leo Varadkar was quite happy with the way that the deal had progressed. And I'm sure that if he felt for 1 second that the outcome of the deal would enable the Troubles to return, he would not have encouraged the deal.
You know, one of the things, Linda, that strikes me about this entire is that when Theresa May took over the helm right after Kamran walked off the job, after this vote had gone through with Brexit, she wasn't, at least from what I remember, during the Brexit campaign, she wasn't on the side of Leave. She was actually a Remainer, from what I remember. Do you think that we could have avoided all of this pain had we had somebody who was a hardcore Brexiteer such as Johnson in place from day one? Because it seems that he's actually delivered really on the promise he made.
Yes, he has delivered, and a Leaver would have been better than Mrs. May. But I think the biggest mistake that she made was calling an election shortly after she was put in post, because she was convinced that she would have a huge victory. And all she did was lose her majority, which put us in the position that we've been in now for the past 3 years.
What do you think, Chris, about this? Because, I mean, it's always baffled me that there would be somebody as Prime Minister of the country who wasn't even really that pro-Leave to then be carrying the process forward for Brexit. I mean, why wasn't somebody like Johnson, not necessarily just Boris Johnson, but somebody else who had voted and very much campaigned for Leave, why wasn't such a person at the helm from day one of this process, do you think?
To be honest, I don't think it really matters in some regard, because I think if there's one thing we've learned through the last 3 years of talking about Brexit, is the understanding of trade and trade relationships is actually very poor. Even today, it's still poor. And you still hear people talking about a fully digitized border. That actually doesn't exist anywhere in the world. There is no such thing as a fully digitized border. There is digital technology to make borders easier, but you have to have some sort of a border point. And so the difference with Northern Ireland, of course, is this history where, there's been enormous conflict, actually. I grew up in that era where, we were effectively at war between the UK and components, at least, of the communities in Ireland, both the Republic and Northern Ireland. So, it really focuses the mind of, one, how important open borders are and what a difference that makes in terms of creating prosperity for everybody, what it means in terms of creating peace for everybody. And then when you try and replace that with another arrangement, just how difficult that has been. This has been the sticking point from day one. Everybody has come up with a solution. This is a solution, but it's not an ideal solution in many ways. It does create more complexity for business. But it is better than having it.
Yeah. One of the things that's come up is how different regions of this United Kingdom voted when it came to that Brexit referendum to begin with. And as we know, in Northern Ireland, 47% are pro-union and had voted, in fact, to remain in Europe. The numbers in Scotland are higher, I believe. Do you think that the unity of this kingdom possibly, I don't want to overstate this, is under threat in some regards, because there are a lot of people questioning that in the future, can these divisions which have arisen now be bridged?
Well, I mean, one of the things I'm saying a lot is that, Brexit is only the beginning. First of all, it's only the beginning of the UK negotiating or renegotiating its trading relationships, not just with Europe, but also the rest of the world. Left with is an incredibly divided country. That is very clear. We do have a constitutional and political crisis where different parts of the UK feel different things, and that's primarily because they have different relationships, both within the UK and also to the European continent. there's terrific disparity across the UK, and of course the core voting for Brexit has really come from the Midlands and the North, where they very much have not had the benefits of trade. You know, the UK has done extremely well from trade, but the benefits have not been distributed in the way that they should, and so we've seen this enormous backlash. And in the UK, that's the form of Brexit. In the US, it's the form of the president and Donald Trump. But in other parts of the world, it takes a different form. Underneath it all, we have to find a way to bring these different divisions together. And so there's enormous stress across the UK right now. And it's very hard to see how that's going to come together in the short term. It's not just stress in a geographical point of view, but it's also stress from a generational point of view. Different generations feel different things, different ways of perceiving their sense of sovereignty and belonging to both the UK and the continent, but also all our trading relationships and the business model that the UK has taken for the last 40 years as a springboard for foreign investors coming into the UK, and how that investment is spread into the regions across the UK.
All right, so Linda, I'll give you the final word. Do you think now we can have better governance, if I may call it that, because you know the criticisms of the EU mechanism very well, Linda, certainly, about how there's just too many regulations, it wasn't benefiting the UK in a fashion that it should have been. Do you think it's finally now, as Donald Trump would say, America first for the UK first?
Well, remember, we still have a democratic system here in the UK, and it may well, I know that the Labour Party are very concerned about the issues around governance and regulation and so forth. But of course, we have things in this country called a general election. So even if we go ahead with this and there are regulatory issues, we can have a general election. And if Labour win that general election, then they're the ones that can actually look at the law around those regulations. So it's something that we need to look at going forward.
And do you think that that will be addressed then, Linda, by this government or future governments, in the sense of, as Chris there was saying, that possibly not all regions across the UK have already benefited from trade that has been occurring over these years?
Yeah, that is definitely something that we have to address, because if we're going to go forward as a nation, we need to go forward as a united nation.
Very well. We'll leave that as our final word. But of course, we both Linda and Chris for their time this morning, and of course for their expert insight on this fluid situation there in the UK right now. Of course, Boris Johnson delivering really on his promise. Many people had doubted on him about this. I'll be honest, even I did as well, because one never knew if Boris Johnson would be able to really convince the EU to renegotiate any part of the deal. And it seems that he's been successful, especially when it comes specifically to the Irish backstop issue. And he's come to some sort of arrangement. Again, it's a complex arrangement, but it does seemingly preserve parts of that Good Friday Agreement and that arrangement that exists at that border, though there will be some customs arrangements in place from going forward if that deal does go through, of course, in the UK Parliament. The date to watch still is October 31st. Will there be a deal? Will the UK Parliament vote for this deal through at this time? That's still very much an open question. It seems the numbers are more now on Johnson's side, seemingly, than they have been in the past for Theresa May. But there are no guarantees really at this point. If those numbers do not fall in place for Johnson, then we'll revisit this, certainly, because there may very well then be a general election of sorts. And what then happens after that to Brexit? More of an extension, certainly. We'll keep a close eye on that here in Scope. I'll be back with my next segment after this break. Stay tuned. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here in Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. In this segment, we're going to discuss Russian influence that is growing across the world, really, but we're going to hone in on the Middle East because, as you know, Vladimir Putin, the president of Russia, recently was on a tour, I should say, of the Middle East, of important countries like the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, as well as the United Arab Emirates, where a number of very important and very significant deals were signed with those two respective countries. We already know, of course, of Russian involvement in Syria as well, Russian influence even possibly over the peace process between Israelis and Palestinians, and just Russian influence really growing across this region as a whole. Not to say, of course, about Russian influence in Asia, Latin America, Africa as well. Why is this happening at this time? Is Russia in some ways replacing U.S. influence in this region and U.S. influence around the world? How is it that Russia played this game a lot smarter, seemingly, than even the Americans did? Let's discuss all of that a bit further. We're joined now by Alexandros Zachariades, who is a PhD researcher in international relations at the London School of Economics. He's joining us now from Cyprus. We're also joined by Kamran Gasanov, who is senior fellow at People's Friendship University of Russia. He's joining us now from Moscow. Kamran and Alexandros, thank you both for your time today. Alexandros, I'd like to start with you. What do you put down to this Russian success, seemingly, in gaining more influence in the Middle East region? It seems, doesn't it, that it's filling a vacuum that possibly America is leaving?
I personally think that that's to a large extent the case. That's why Russia is able to exert that sort of influence in the Middle East, because you have to bear in mind that when the Americans first tried to pull off from Iraq during the Obama administration, that essentially left a huge vacuum of power that none of the regional powers were able to fill. And in the debacle that followed with the Syrian civil war and in the Iraq war, Russia was able to come in, not only just to safeguard President Assad, but to come in and to replace the United States, even in Iraq, obviously with the help of Iran in the process, which is the main regional player that Russia has in the region. And that has allowed it to reestablish itself within the Middle East.
Okay, Kamran, what are your thoughts on that? Because, again, it's interesting that Russia would be able to sign these sorts of deals with Saudi Arabia, with the UAE, and, continue its involvement in Syria at a time that it seems to be under pressure from much of the West, be it America, Russia collusion in elections, et cetera, or even Europe.
I think there are two main reasons. The first of all, the power of Russia, that Russia is strengthening, even when we speak in economic terms or military terms. Russia modernized its army last 2 dozens of years, and Russia is able not only to defend itself when we speak, for example, about 90s, when we had problems in Chechnya and so on, and even conduct operations abroad. First of all, Syria, and also Russia has now capability to sell arms. Russia is on the second place in this term after the United States, and sell arms not only to the enemies of the United States, but also to the allies. The third reason is that Russia has its own principle in foreign policy. It has no precondition when it cooperates with foreign powers, as the United States. For example, when Washington cooperates with one country, it says you should implement democracy principles, you should respect human rights, and so on. Russia, as well as China, doesn't have this problem. Also, one important reason is the creation of alliances, and not only with U.S. Enemies, as I said, and also with its allies. The good example is Astana Agreement with Turkey and Iran, and also bilateral contacts with China. It's also important that now the United States has problems in trade with China, and China has more impetus to cooperate with Russia. And as the expert said from London School of Economics, the behavior of the United States, that it has it broke down in conflicts over the world, and it makes a vacuum of power.
All right, so Alexandros, one of the things that strikes me is that this is still a risky strategy, isn't it, on the part of Russia to be involved in the fashion it is in the Middle East? I mean, this could all, blow back on it, couldn't it? Because, I mean, America seemingly has failed in some of its policies in this region. Will Russia be able to succeed where America has failed?
I think we have to acknowledge two very important facts here. The United States has gone in the region with the aim of not only regime change when it did in 2003, but also with the aim of establishing liberal democracy. And that ambition is actually a very an ambition that hasn't not allowed the United States to. It was a maximalist ambition, in a sense. It was, I would say, too ambitious. The difference with Russia is that Russia doesn't come to the Middle East now. The Middle East has a very important place within the strategic thought of Russia since the Tsars all the way through the Soviet Union coming to the modern era. So I think that the goals which Russia seeks to achieve within the Middle East are much more modest than what the United States had in mind. And at the same time is what the fellow expert from Moscow has argued, Russia doesn't have any internal politics preconditions when it provides its support. It doesn't want or it doesn't need its partners within the foreign policy stage to alter their own internal state behavior to match its.
But I'm interested in you saying that, Alexandros, because I mean, for me, for example, when I see Russia is in alliance with Iran, for example, and is also now signing deals with Saudi Arabia and the UAE, and as you well know, those countries have their own differences right now in this region. Can Russia play enough of a balancing act to be able to handle both?
I think that when it comes to the Saudi Arabia and the UAE, I believe that Russia does and move on with the deals that it has in the past. But at the same time, there's an acknowledgement from the Russian side that it's not able to bring Saudi Arabia within, let's sort of say, the Russian sphere of influence, because of the importance that Saudi Arabia has had in the strategic understanding of the United States in the Middle East. And I don't think even in the days of President Trump, when he seeks to withdraw from the region, that relationship will break, because it goes back to a very important commodity, oil. And I think what Russia is trying to do is trying to be able to have open lines of communication with all members of the Middle East, with all the key players, and in many cases try to use that political capital that it has gained to broker agreements or to be able to mediate between its allies on the one hand and its partners, if you may, on the other.
All right, so let me put that to Kamran then. Kamran, would it be overstating Russia's goals to say that it wants to bring in friendship between all the countries in the Middle East? I mean, do you think that it's not trying to, again, do all of that in one go, that it just wants, for the sake of itself, its own interests to be preserved in the region, to sign deals and to just move on? Or do you think it does actually want to play an active role in creating peace?
I think the strategic interest of Russia is to guarantee that in this region will not be conflicts, wars, because Middle East is neighbor region for Russia, and in case of wars, we have a lot of threats for Russia. First of all, terrorists, which could move from Middle East to Caucasus and from there to Russian territory. The second threat is migrants. It's also possible, for example, if the United States attack Iran, all of these migrants will flow to Russian territory. As for the role, I think Russia is already playing active role, and Russia has already returned to the region, and I read the headlines of U.S. articles. All of them say that Russia is already there and is even replacing the United States. And I want to return to the question about Saudi Arabia and Iran. I would say that it's very difficult conflict. It's about religion also, and the conflict between Shia and Sunni religion. And one benefit of Russia here is that we have good relations both with Iran and Saudi Arabia. The United States doesn't have this. Iran is enemy. And Putin already said that we can help to mediate this problem when both sides are ready. If both sides are ready.
I'm going to have to interrupt you, Kamran. I do apologize. The clock has best of us, but I do appreciate both of our guests, of course, for their time and, of course, their insight. Alexandros was joining us from London, not Cyprus, as I had said mistakenly at the beginning. We appreciate his time, and, of course, we appreciate Kamran as well, who is speaking to us from Moscow, for his time and insight and putting this all into context for us. Certainly, it's interesting to see how the dynamics in this region, or in fact globally, are changing with the fact that America, and especially America under Donald Trump, is not seeking, in his own words at least, to intervene everywhere in the world and to have its hands in every pot throughout the world. It seems that Russia's now seemingly trying to fill that vacuum, consciously or unconsciously, really. If this is, a very conscious effort on the part of Russia, it seems to be working with it signing all these deals in Saudi Arabia and the UAE during Putin's latest visits there. Is he going to try to then broker some sort of peace in this region between the likes of Iran, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE? We don't know, of course, but he is friends, as Kamran said, with both sides, and that certainly puts Russia in a very unique position as arguably another superpower in the world that is rising also at this time. So it's something that we must watch, the Russian influence in the Middle East region, the power of Russia growing. Is its power for then peacemaking growing as well? We'll talk about that, of course, in later shows here on Scope. I'll be back with my last segment after this break. Stay tuned. Welcome back, viewers. In this last segment of today's show, we're going to discuss an Islamophobia row, as happens often seemingly coming out of France. A French Muslim woman is now at the center of a new row, which has occurred because she was in her Islamic veil, her hijab, and she was visiting along with her child and other children from her child's school, was visiting a regional assembly, and then a far-right politician essentially began bullying her and telling her that she wasn't welcome in that area because of the fact that she was wearing a veil. Now, it's interesting that the reactions that have come out since that occurred are that a number of ministers, sitting ministers, actually are saying that, though the law does not prohibit women from wearing headscarves to accompany children, the headscarf itself is not desirable in our society. That was the French education minister. The government spokeswoman had said that it was important to allow for the space for exchanges between women who wear headscarves and those who don't, as that promoted inclusivity. But then the economy minister defended this incident seemingly as well, in not so many terms, as well as the budget minister also. Now, the French newspaper Le Monde has actually released an open letter by 90 academics and public figures of different sorts to Emmanuel Macron, the French president, calling on him to confront Islamophobia. And let's discuss that all a bit further. We're joined now by Rimsar Alouane, who is a PhD candidate in comparative law at the University of Toulouse-Capitole. Her research focuses on civil liberties, human rights, and religious freedom. She's joining us now from Washington, D.C. We're also joined by Donia Ismail, who is a journalist, and she is joining us now from the French capital, Paris. Donia and Rimsar, thank you both for your time today. Rimsar, I'd like to start with you. What are your thoughts about this incident? It makes for a disturbing watch when you look at this video, because the child then starts crying. So, this sort of bullying, is it now become almost acceptable in France?
It's shameful. It's absolutely shameful. It goes against our motto of liberty, equality, and fraternity for all. First of all, we have separation of church and state in this country through laicity. And laicity and the law on separation of church and state does not prevent people from expressing their religion in the public space. Laicity just applies to civil servants student at school since 2004, and people representing the state, not the citizen. What happened to this woman basically is, so you're going to help teachers with the kids on the school trip. You're going to teach them and have them learning about our democratic process through visiting a representative assembly. And what do we tell you? You cannot be part of us because of what you believe in and how you look. Shameful.
Yeah. And Donia, what are your thoughts about that? Because, it sort of defies logic where you're actually going to a democratic assembly to teach students seemingly about the democratic process, but then you have somebody being targeted because of, a religious symbol that they wear. That sort of doesn't really work together, does it?
No, not at all. And it is really, really shameful, as the other woman said. But it's because in France we have this belief that Islamophobia is an opinion and not a crime. But it's a crime, and you can be sentenced to a fine when you attack Muslim based on their religious belief or whatever. But we have this strong belief that Islamophobia is an opinion, and it's because maybe our own ministers are publicly attacking Muslim women for the veil and saying they're not desirable, like we shouldn't have veiled women in France. That's really legitimate people in the street attacking Muslim. It's because their own governments have these kind of statements.
Yeah, indeed. And Rimsara, what are your thoughts on the fact that politicians, as Donia there said, are seemingly okay with Islamophobia? I mean, I wonder, in a France which is very proud of its secular nature, does Islam and Muslims not really have a place, or is that place for them growing smaller?
It has been going on forever, unfortunately. French Muslims are Muslims, French citizens, something that our political elite has a hard time to accept. Why? You have to go back to the roots of the issue, which is the colonization of Algeria, where Muslims were not considered French at that time, which led later to the War of Independence. Then we had multiple measures against Muslim and mainly against Muslim women. First, the law of 2004 on the prohibition of religious sign at school, which actually mainly targeted girls wearing a hijab. Yeah. Then we had the prohibition of the full face covering in 2010. Less than 2,000 women wear what we call the niqab, right? The full face covering certain women wear. It was prohibited on the ground of public order. Then we have the shameful burkini ban, where certain mayors in some French beaches prohibit women wearing that kind of garment to go swimming. There is a very famous picture of cops asking Muslim women to uncover, right? And now we have this. Unfortunately, this trend is extremely dangerous. Our political elite are trying to appeal to a certain part of our electorate, not to name the far right. But it's not just the right. It's not just the far right. It's also the left. There is a dangerous movement of radical secular left who is also joining the anti-Muslim party. And this is not going well for our democracy, and certainly it violates our very own laicity, which again protects freedom of religion and conscience.
But then, Donia, the argument would be this: France is a democracy, and a recent poll found that 2 in 3 French people are actually in favor of prohibiting parents accompanying children on school trips who wear visible religious symbols. It seems the French public is on the side of these politicians, and be they far left or far right, but they seem to be against the hijab and are okay with Islamophobia too. That's worrying, isn't it?
Yes, it is, but it's because they've been served again and again the same rhetoric. You know what I mean? Like for ages, for decades and decades, we've heard in France that the veil has a political meaning when it doesn't have, and it's the thing that because France has been under attacks, Islamic attacks, terrorism, the Bataclan and the Charlie Hebdo attack in 2015, we have this belief that women wearing a veil have this political scheme behind their head, that they want to impose Islam as the national religion, when it's not. We are literally, France is literally turning veiled women into demons. You know what I mean? Like, we are, France is giving them, is legitimating this idea that veiled women are the only thing that they want to do is to convert everyone in France, when they are just following beliefs, like internal and personal belief, and that's the issue. It's that for ages we've been criticizing Islam, and we've been attacking Muslim because they are Muslim. Like, there's nothing else. We're just attacking them, even if it's Islamophobia, and we don't acknowledge it as a racist comment. They said. I mean, that's an opinion. So it's easy for the whole public to just say the same.
Indeed, and Rimsar, one of that also baffles me is the fact that France actually has quite a large and important minority of Muslims, in fact, population, I believe the largest in Europe, if I'm not mistaken. How then does the country suppose it will move forward with this population still there? Because these are very much, as you had said as well, and as Donia there said, these are very much French citizens. They've grown up, they've been there for generations. What happens going forward?
This is not sustainable at all. France need to think in what kind of society they want to live in, really. Where are we going when we have 24/7 hour media and pundits literally going after Muslim citizens? Just recently, many journalists on those platforms comparing the hijab to a Nazi uniform, right? Which is, I think we went... There is a point of no return here. We crossed a line, and it's going to be very difficult to go back. And the irony is that French Muslims are just asking one thing from their political elite: A, to be considered as French citizens; B, to respect laicity. And unfortunately, other political considerations are being taken into account, and I'm not sure it's going to end well at all. We have a history of discrimination in this country, on this continent. And again, this is not sustainable. So the best way is really to apply the law and to consider everybody equal citizens.
Donia, Macron, when he took office, many people said, oh my God, he'd be a breath of fresh air, that he's tolerant and welcoming of all people. That's at least the public image of Macron. Why is it that even a president like that would be okay with all of this, seemingly? And do you think that going forward that letter that's been released, that open letter that's been written by those 90 public figures, that will have any sort of an effect on Macron himself and what he does going forward about Islamophobia within France?
Well, during the election, he never really talked about this, so we don't really know what his point of view on this. And even after the letter, he had this little speech when he said we shouldn't stigmatize the Muslim, but we should fight political Islam. So we don't really know what he can do or what he's really thinking about this. And same, I'm a bit pessimistic because I don't think that a letter, even though it's a big step and for the first time Muslim and even people who are not Muslim sign this column, but I don't think that this would be enough to change the whole political aspect about the veil, because as we said before, it's been here in France for decades and decades and decades. So it's a long fight for sure, but I don't think Macron has want to say something about this. I don't know. Like in few years we have the election, the presidential election, and siding with Muslim he would lose a lot. So It's a bit complicated to really understand what he has behind in his head.
Right. Okay, we'll leave there as a final word, but we appreciate Donia and Reem Sarah for their time today and, of course, for their expert insight on this issue and putting this all into context for us, because it's a really important issue. I mean, even trying to do this show, we had a hard time finding people who would be willing to, in fact, talk about Islamophobia in France, which is interesting in and of itself, considering there are so many Muslims there. And, it's such an important and vital topic to be discussing. It seems that it's one of those things that is almost taboo to talk about. And as I said, it's disturbing to have sitting ministers in a government be okay with a Muslim woman who is chaperoning her child and other children to a regional assembly to again learn about the democratic process, for her to be targeted and bullied because of the fact that she is wearing hijab. What does that say about how radical this secularism is in France? Do Muslims really just not have a place in France? Is that the message that France is trying to give to its own French citizens who are of Muslim origin and practice their Muslim faith enthusiastically? Do they not have the right to practice their Muslim faith? Will they now force women to, quote unquote, be free on their terms and not the women's own personal choice? We'll leave it there for now. I've been Waqar Rizvi. Thanks for watching.